So we're moving on to our second panel, which is on this data issue that the first panel spent a fair amount of time, I think, quite productively talking about without hopefully stealing our thunder or foreshadowing too much. The issue is whether we can take steps that will make this market more efficient by providing reliable data to all players in the market. And we've got a group of people who've thought quite a bit about that and, in fact, have made some proposals of varying formalities. So I'm just going to introduce everyone extremely quickly, and then we'll get right into the meat of this. So to my right is Jacqueline Charlesworth. To the right of the table is Jacqueline Charlesworth. She's the General Counsel and Associate Register of Copyright at the U.S. Copyright Office. She practiced previously at Morrison & Foerster in New York. She was also Senior Vice President and General Counsel at the National Music Publishers Association and the General Counsel of the Harry Fox Agency. To her left is Mark Eisenberg, the VP of Strategic Initiatives at SoundExchange. He was previously the Executive Vice President at Sony Music Entertainment and the Head of Business and Legal Affairs for the Global Digital Business Group there. To my immediate right is Andrea Finkelstein, the Senior Vice President of Business Affairs at Sony Music Entertainment. She's also a director at SoundExchange. She was formerly at CBS Records after graduating from the Columbia Business School. She's been in the music industry, I think, pretty much throughout. Am I correct?
Yes, since dinosaurs roamed the earth.
Not quite. To my left is James Griffin, the Managing Director of OneHouse, which is a consultancy in the digital media markets. He was previously at Geffen Records in the tech group and did a lot of interesting stuff there, if you read his bio at OneHouse. And also he was an international representative for the Newspaper Guild. Then to his left is Casey Ray, the Director of Music Licensing at Sirius XM. You might have known him formerly as the CEO for the Future of Music Coalition, and we're grateful for his presence as well. Finally, lurking somewhere in the audience is Professor Lawrence White. He is the Robert Case Professor of Economics at NYU Stern. He focuses on financial regulation, antitrust, and network industries. So, Jacqueline, I wanted to direct my first question to you, and I just wanted to have an informal conversation, which I think will cover a lot of ground. But the Copyright Office came out with a music licensing report, which has a lot of stuff in it that we can dig into. One of the things it has in it is a proposal for a set of MROs, or music rights organizations, that will interact with something that you call, I believe, a GMRO, or a General Music Rights Organization. So how do you envision these organizations working? What role would the Copyright Office play in them? What role would the various participants in the industry play in them, and how would they operate?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. This is one of the data issue. I mean, I think it was set up very nicely, I agree, by the last panel. In fact, Steve Marks, I don't know if he's still here, said something I always say, which is if you could solve this issue, a lot of the other, I think, debates and concerns would be greatly diminished and some would fall away, because a lot of I think it holds the view of the Copyright Office, not just my view, is that having these issues plaguing the industry, particularly on the musical work side, really holds the entire industry back, and it doesn't benefit anyone. So a couple of years ago, the Copyright Office did a study. In fact, some of it was, we had some of the roundtables. I was reminded right here in this room. We issued a big fat report, which you can buy at Amazon for $5, or you can download for free from the Copyright Office site, since it is not subject to copyright. But anyway, as part of that project, there is quite a bit in there. We really were trying to look at how to rationalize the sort of government regime, the government intervention into the music marketplace, how to make it a fairer regime, how to make it more efficient. And obviously a big part of that question is how to fix the sort of mechanics of the licensing system as opposed to the rates and so forth. So that's what I'm going to focus on. That's largely in the back of the report. We have several different systems, as you probably know if you're sitting here. We have the Section 114, the sound recording performance license, which is under government regulation, and is administered by SoundExchange. And what we found in the report is quite a few of the participants think that system functions pretty well. And in fact, SoundExchange, since we wrote the report, has made public a database of ISRC numbers. I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit more about that. That I think is a very useful tool, and has generally, where you only have usually one owner of a sound recording, that part of the data system is working somewhat better. On the musical work side, we heard a lot about split works and so forth. You have multiple entities operating under different government regimes. We have the PROs, who are regulated by the federal rate courts, who each have important data sets in terms of the publishers and songwriters they represent. And then you have the Harry Fox Agency, now part of CSAC, which has a database relating to mechanical rights. And unfortunately, these sort of sets of data tend to be fairly siloed. They're not collected in one place. They're not in a public database. And so one of the important concepts, which I think many around the table, or at least the earlier table, agreed to, is that it would be extraordinarily beneficial to have an authoritative public database that anyone could rely on in terms of on the musical work side, as well as on the sound recording side. So the question in the report that we tried to handle, at least sort of sketch out, we certainly didn't get to the fine details, but sort of tried to figure out how would we do that. And we did. One of the important principles of our report, I think, is we sort of took the world as we find it or found it, as opposed to, you could imagine a way better system, but we tried to think about ways to leverage what we have today and the important organizations and who are involved and administer the current system, and how to try and leverage that system to create this database. And so we came up with, as well as the existing statutory licenses, we recommended certain changes to that, including moving the PRO system over, to the extent there's any rate regulation, over to the CRB system. So you have sort of more consistency in the way, to the extent we're setting rates, the way those rates would be set. But as part of that, we also recommended that the entities who were administering statutory licensing, which we called music rights organizations, to distinguish them from PROs, which currently today administer only performance rights. We recommended that they be able to take on mechanical rights, and potentially other rights as well, and rename them MROs. That those organizations would take at least the key elements of data of the songs that they represent and submit them to a public database that would be operated by what we call the general MRO. If someone has a better acronym, I'm all for it. The GMRO, I think we suggested SoundExchange, and then I saw someone that might be taken. But anyway, something that I think in our heads was somewhat similar to SoundExchange in terms of its SoundExchange, is designated by the Copyright Royalty Board, actually, and there's a little bit of a regulatory regime, but it's a nonprofit and has a fair amount of latitude to, and has, in fact, built their databases out and really, worked hard to achieve what they've achieved. In any event, we propose that the MROs sort of feed data into this general licensing organization for the benefit of everyone, and that there obviously you need to fund that, and we suggested maybe there would be an administrative fee or some kind of surcharge to help fund their operations. And one last thing, and then I think I want to hear from others, but a really key part of this, which I don't think has come out yet as much in the discussion, is the key to the system is really relating the sound recordings to the musical works, because if you're a digital service, you know the track. You hopefully maybe sometimes have what's called the ISRC, which is the recording code. But in order, you need, obviously a musical work can be recorded many times and so forth, but the sort of what I've always called the keys to the kingdom, for whoever figures this out, and I think people have started working on it, is matching that track to the underlying musical work. And, to that end, there's ISWC, a very important identifier. We'll probably hear more about that. That's assigned to musical works, sometimes not until a little bit, fairly after the time they're created because it involves, the splits and so forth. But we did recommend that this organization, or that there be a regulatory oversight to kind of, help identify what we call universal identifiers, the ISRC, ISWC. ISNI was another one we recommended to uniquely identify artists, and that work be done not only just to try and encourage and incentivize the use of standard identifiers, but also to really use some of the funding of the system to do the matching work, so that the service who uses the track will then know what composition they're using. So that was the gist of what we outlined. There's more detail in the report, but we've been very interested in hearing, and I'm interested in hearing the feedback on that.
So I think the report's a great achievement, and we owe the Copyright Office some thanks for it. I want to make a follow-up, which is the architecture of the system that you've proposed. So it's distributed, but it's hybrid. There's a central database as well. So what's the role of the Copyright Office that you would see in maintaining this centralized piece of the architecture, the General Music Rights Organization?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. What we recommended in the report, although I think it's open for discussion, is that that this be housed in a nonprofit, as I said, similar to SoundExchange. The role of the Copyright Office would be maybe to help set regulations, maybe in terms of benchmarks for, say defining the information that would have to be supplied up to the general MRO. I think, for example, I think this was an example we gave in the report. Yes, you need to know maybe the name of the work, the ISRC, the ISWC, and those sorts of data points, but you don't necessarily need the name and address of the songwriter, because the idea would be you'd still have individual entities, these MROs out there, who are actually sending the money out. The GMRO would really be, I think, at least in our vision, housed in a nonprofit entity with a fair amount of flexibility within, but under some degree of regulatory oversight in terms of probably the administrative charges and so forth, but really would have a fair amount of flexibility to operate and build a data system similar to SoundExchange.
So can I move back conceptually and just ask, how did we get to this point? So the Copyright Office puts out a report that recommends an architecture for data. Why don't we have an architecture for data? So anyone like to take a whack at that? So what is it about the way that music licensing has happened historically that we're at the place we are? So SoundExchange has built out a database on the recording side. Why don't we have a database on the other side, and why don't these databases talk?
Well, I think one of the things that was mentioned in the last panel, I think Steve had mentioned the historical pass-through rights of a bundled product. So when you're dealing with a sell-through product, the distributor label, Sony Music, Warner, whomever, licensed in the mechanical on a statutory basis, and there was no need for the end user, either the consumer or the retailer, to do all that, logistical work. Once you went into the digital arena, it became much more complicated because the configurations were exponential between ringtones and streams and tethered downloads and full downloads. Make your head explode, different types of configurations, and it just got very, very complicated in terms of how to figure it out. And that created the need for the database, but that was probably 15 to 17 years ago, and we're still at the same place that we are now.
Right, so 15 to 17 years, so there's people say that business moves quickly and government moves slowly, and here's an maybe odd situation where we have government encouraging business to move, right? So
Well, and there was a fundamental change, and that was that we went from product to service, and the service had a statutory license, so you did not have to engage in licensing activity before you used the work. Whereas in a product-based world, you would know. You would say, okay, I'm going to use this song, I'm going to put it on this album,
Right.
The money would come back to you. Now you could set up a service, notice SoundExchange properly, but thereafter, you might not know who to pay or how to get them paid. And then that is dumped in SoundExchange's lap. And by the way, I have nothing but admiration for SoundExchange. They've done a fantastic job in this circumstance. And coming forth with the database that they have addresses one of the most significant problems we have. Now, it needs to be a bigger database, but they've gotten at my first biggest problem, which is people knowing the ISRC code so they could report properly.
So can we talk about how to scale this? So we have SoundExchange as an example on the recording side. Of course, much more needs to be done. If you were to think about this, Jim, in terms of scale, right, you've just heard Jacqueline talk about the architecture that the Copyright Office envisions. What do you envision? How would we scale this up?
Well, the only odd thing about that, and again, love the report and so forth, it's that the report or the articulation of it is, let SoundExchange do it, and I think that's great. I think SoundExchange should do it. But my question back would be, why not, when someone registers a copyright, ask them the ISRC code and the ISWC code and make that a part of the Copyright Office record? Because that is the public record that people look at. I have no problem with them going to SoundExchange. And again, this is critical because the part that I'm focused on, which is a little bit different than the licensing part, just because I think it's a problem right now, is reporting. Is making it faster, easier, and simpler to pay the right person. Now, that's a problem because when we report the use of music, at step one, we're reporting it ambiguously. We're reporting artist name, song title, album title, and trust me, there's 100 ways to spell the name of the band U2.
Most people probably understand this, but could you just fill in, someone on the panel want to fill in what an ISRC code and an ISWC code
There's
is
three
actually
codes that are critical to our business, a three-legged stool. ISRC is the International Standard Recording Code for the sound recording. ISWC is the code for the work, the International Standard Work Code. And then ISNI is the International Standard on Names and Identifiers. This ISRC code is the one that if you were using music, you would be most likely to have access to or should be reporting with because it is a globally unique identifier for the sound recording. Now, few people are using sheet music, so they probably know this is the sound recording I'm using. I'm saying, let's stop reporting with artist name, song title, album title, and move to a globally unique identifier. This part is critical so that the information that arrives at Mark's office at SoundExchange is unambiguous. We need to wring the ambiguity out of that system so that every time a penny arrives, we know how it was generated.
So people will say that there's data quality issues. We get that out in the
Yeah, but let me, the topic, Katie brought it up in the previous panel, safe harbors. And I sometimes worry about safe harbors, but let me suggest one very productive safe harbor in the context of what we're talking about here, which is if we're going to have this database, we need the incentives, as Jacqueline mentioned, to get people to contribute. One strong incentive would be the following safe harbor. A distributor makes a good faith effort to search a centralized database. If the distributor does not find an ownership piece of information and goes ahead and plays the piece of music anyway, the distributor cannot be sued for infringement because they made a good faith effort, the ownership information wasn't there, sorry, you should have contributed the information, you have no basis for suing. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I would never practice law without a license, but it strikes me that that provides a powerful incentive for the owners of the rights to contribute their information into a centralized
I just want to make sure I understand the scope of that. So does that amount essentially to extended collective licensing? So for example, if I'm the owner of a music work and I don't want to enter into the system,
okay.
what
but
do I do then?
That gets me to the second, which is, gee, we've got to get away from compulsory, mandatory, statutory, whatever term you want, that it's the mandatory licensing that leads to a lot of the kinds of issues that you just described. Once you have mandatory licensing, you got to have regulation because if I've got mandatory, a statutory right to play your music, I'm going to say, and I'll pay you, 0.05 of a cent to play it, and you're going to say, no, you want $5 for the right, and somebody's got to adjudicate that. So we've got to get away from mandatory. We've got to get away from mandatory.
Casey, in our previous discussions, you had suggested that players in the industry are making some moves that are going to result in the assembly over time of data. Could you describe a little bit of what you see happening on the ground and where it's headed?
Well, just a clarifier, anything that I would say with regard to my observations of that space is based on previous 10 years of observation of that space. In my current position, I'm mostly concerned with figuring out what the data pipe between direct suppliers on the sound recording side and the service are, and how to make that work efficiently for both parties. I do believe that there's a tremendous amount of activity in the marketplace on both sides of the copyright right now. There are folks who are building proprietary systems, which personally I don't actually think are going to be effective at addressing the persistent global issues that have already been brought up. But I think that we can have the concept of a global database, and maybe someday we'll even achieve it. I think that it would be perfectly within the Copyright Office's mandate to be a standards body and perhaps even the repository of those numeric identifiers that Jim mentioned. I also think that as long as we have similar catcher's mitts, when we're receiving this information and we're committed to minimum viable data standards that we all recognize, then a lot of those problems will start to fall to the wayside, and we may end up in a self-healing phase, which will probably take a while, but ultimately, hopefully, will allow us to leave less money on the table wherever we sit, and result in a slow eradication of the mistrust that is unfortunately built up because of these persistent data issues.
So Andrea, you're dealing with SoundExchange at Sony, and you are contributing data to that database. Can you tell us a little bit about how that actually works? So how do you keep data flowing? How do you clean it up when there are problems? And how efficient is this from your perspective?
I mean, on the master recording side, we send a feed of all of our master recordings to SoundExchange probably monthly, and that will refresh data that was sent previously if it needs to be refreshed. So I think that process works pretty well. I mean, there are a lot of variations these days in terms of distribution rights, and I think for the industry overall, the compilation products are still a big issue in terms of master ownership. We see a lot of conflicts from compilations and soundtracks. So I think on the master recording side, that's working pretty well. We've supplied all of our ISRCs so that now they're in the ISRC database that SoundExchange gives public access to, so that's been a positive step. But I think we're sort of conflating a lot of issues between statutory services and non-statutory services. So the same way we send SoundExchange a list of all of our repertoire, when we do a new partner integration with a digital music service, we send a full file of all the master recordings that we're making available, and those are all tagged. And so from the services perspective, they know everything that we've sent, and that works fairly well because we do proactively advise them. I mean, we had suggested at one point that maybe we could include the ISWC as an element of the metadata if we were in a position to assign it, so that we could then not be holding anything up in the supply chain. We would make that available so that it would be part of the record from day one when it went into the ether. And there was some resistance to that, which I think kind of came about because we tend to not look at workflow and the implications of these numbers. And you really do need to step back and say, okay, what is the ISWC? What is it used for? And figure out if by putting it on early on, you've somehow destroyed your ability to use it for the thing that you need to use it for. Because one of our big problems in the industry is that the data is extremely dynamic, particularly on the publishing side where catalogs change hands. It comes in dribs and drabs, so it's not like you get it wrapped with a bow from day one, and so you can say we're not putting this release out until we have the data. The split data, the publisher ownership data can come in for years after the release comes out. Everyone has an incentive to get the products out. So you really do need to deal with that reality of changing dynamic data.
Can I dig into this a little bit?
Yes,
And
certainly.
Jim, go ahead, make a comment
I
first.
just have
and
a
I
quick
wanna dig into
observation,
that.
and that is that the big companies are doing it great. They really are. You know, we've gotten to where the center of the network, which is where creativity used to reside, has nailed it. But creativity has moved from the center of the network out to the edge. So we have to design now database systems that accommodate an enormous amount of UGC, user-generated content, and things that are coming from the fringe of the network. So this is a fundamental change.
I don't even think we've solved the mainstream yet.
Yeah,
Well, no, but I think they're
Core still
making,
has-
they're doing they're well-intended, they're capable, they do an extremely good job at the major labels, especially working with SoundExchange. And my hat's off to you.
Wow.
Sony's a great,
Compliment
look at a
your major
company like
labels.
Sony.
Mark this day
Sony is a technology company, and it's a terrific one. You know, the integration there has brought great advance. All I'm pointing out is that a lot of our problems are from the edge, and they're people, we may not even know where they are, who they are.
But
or-
We've still got problems at the core, and this is the association
Yeah.
between publishing and sound recording.
So one of the things that happened when you went to call it a decentralized or debundled product is that the label was no longer the gatekeeper of the
Right.
finished product. So the label said, well, I'll take care of my stuff. That's the master recording. The ISRCs are down pat. The publishing is, we'll leave that to the publishers or to the digital service providers to figure out. I think we have to come back to what Jacqueline was saying, was the reintegration. It's a single exploited product at the end of the day, the stream, the download. There are different rates and perhaps different administration schemes for that, but the data has to be married.
All right, so let me dig a bit into what Andrea said and try to figure out, before we marry data, what the problems are in getting the data right. So we have an ISRC code that's assigned to a master recording. We have ISWC codes that are attached to musical works. Now, I've heard that the data ambiguity issues are worse there because of the split ownership. Is that why?
Yeah, I mean, someone, who's more intimately involved in that process could explain it better, but at when we did the study, what I learned, I mean, the ISWC is not typically assigned until the split issues have been worked out. And so, to your point about registration, I mean, often you would register the song before all that happened to make sure it's protected. Whereas the ISRC can be assigned, I think, a little bit more quickly because it's one owner, and I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about that process. But so the problem is that you have, the ISWC hasn't been assigned because you don't know exactly precisely who the owners are, what percentages they have, and that takes a while. And that's going to happen sometimes after the sound recording is actually in the marketplace, which is, I think, what Andrea was
Right, but I
was
think
saying.
that goes back to the workflow issue of
Yeah.
really needing to assess what you're doing with the ISWC, because putting a number on something doesn't seem to take away anyone's rights to the thing. All you've done is given a way to pull it back later and aggregate all the things under one number. So,
But
Right.
that song can be recorded by others. See,
Right,
that's
but
the problem.
if
Is
you give
it's
the number and you put it in a database and the next guy can look it up, I mean, because most of the products that we're putting out are first uses. I mean, we know, I mean, obviously we put out cover versions, but we know pretty much with 99% certainty when something's a first use. If you're just calling it number 4, later on, if someone wants to record it, they look it up and they see it's called number 4.
But the problem is I think that what the response would be, the number 4 has to point to the owners, and you're suggesting it's just sort of a number
No, then we give it to whoever maintains
Yeah.
their own database, and they assign all the information.
So
Yeah.
what we're
relative
talking
to
about
publishers.
is a way to signal global updates, because the thing is, information can be updated and it can be 100% accurate on the publishing side with regard to owners and joint works. However, that still might be siloed. And without the ability to actually confidently query ownership, at a global scale quickly, we're going to continue to have many of the same
The point
problems.
is, you need to know where to go for the license. And so if the number,
I hate to sound like an economist, but gee,
Well,
it's about incentives. If you can't get, if you can't sue because you didn't provide the information, people are going to be coming forward
That's-
with the
that's
information.
Lawrence,
true, although that raises some Berne Convention issues. So we have a system here where you can't you know, under Byrne, you can't predicate protection for your copyright on formalities. And so, but you can have statutory licenses. And so that's why the approach of the report was sort of looking at this what we do have under the government regime and trying to figure out how to leverage that to get data into the system. I mean, there's some nuance to that discussion. I think Jim has, I think it's a fair, one question is, when you do register, which is not required for copyright protection, when you do register, should you have to supply these numbers? That then gets to the question is, are the numbers available? You know, when are you registering? Often sound recordings, I mean, there's a lot of problems with leakage. You know, they're registered very quickly to try, in case they're leaked. I don't know if the ISRC is on there at that point. We actually will accept them even now, but the problem is, you know, getting people to comply with that and having the information available. It's what Andrea is suggesting is sort of interesting in that, you know, should we assign a number to the musical work before we've worked out the ownership splits?
And very
is your
quick,
suggestion.
we do have incentives, Lawrence. For example, 115C3 says you're not entitled to mechanical royalties unless you've registered with the Copyright Office.
Right.
You cannot sue for a willful infringement and get statutory
That's,
damages.
it does not
unless
say
you-
that.
Oh, what? What's that?
115.
Oh, no, I promise you, I'll look it up right now. 115C3 says that if you have not registered, you are not entitled to compulsory royalties under the mechanical, for the mechanical, until such time as you have registered. We could look it up right
There
now.
are
I know how
powerful
to do it.
incentives for registration, but the question is, with respect to registration, so you're worried about people falsely registering ownership through ISWCs? Is that?
No, I'm not worried about false, it's not about falsely registering ownership. It's just about, again, all of this really goes to trying to connect the work to the owners. Or the work, in the case of music, you have the additional problem of connecting the musical work to the sound recording. So whenever, for the number, for for it to have any utility, ultimately it has to be able to perform that function. So if you haven't figured out who the owners are, you might have I mean, it could maybe be later married to, I mean, maybe this is your, Andrea's suggestion, you know, I think it is. You're saying workflow, like let's think about, and I think that's an interesting idea. It's sort of let's think about where in the process and how long it takes to figure that out and whether it's worthwhile having a marker, like sort of a temporary number that doesn't necessarily connect it to the owners. But it's, all I'm saying is under the current framework, the ISWC is not available on day one usually. And it takes a while because when the PROs who are largely in charge of that system go in and assign them, they want to know actually who owns the work and in what shares, because that's really what enables them to perform their licensing function.
So Jim, very briefly. And then I wanna move on.
115C1. To be entitled to receive royalties under a compulsory license, the copyright owner must be identified in the registration or other public records of the Copyright Office. The owner is entitled to royalties for phonorecords made and distributed after being so identified, but is not entitled to recover for any phonorecords previously made and distributed.
It'd be interesting to see if the Copyright Office could, as part of its rulemaking or
I'm sure
guidance,
there's a circular
say
somewhere.
what
Yeah.
that is, what that
Well,
involves.
you can file with the office, you know, if you can't identify.
You can notice the office, but
Right.
because if you don't notice the office, it's not a question of royalties, it's a
Right.
question of infringement, which is far worse.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to this question of how to marry the musical work to the sound recording, because this is a question that is really bedeviling, I think, the industry right now. So streaming services, they stream sound recordings, and these sound recordings have associated musical works, and there is a reasonably high rate of error, from what I can tell right now, associating the musical work, the underlying musical work with the sound recordings they stream, and this creates significant potential liability. So in a system of databases that contain musical work information, that contain sound recording information, how do we marry the two, since we have this split copyright system? And to get rid of that would be a huge reform, right? So how do we, if we are going to have the split copyright, how do we, in real time, marry the two so that the royalties can flow to the parties who should be getting them? How do we do it now, and how could we do it better?
Well, one way was to change the workflow, which Andrea was talking about. The other way is to have databases that are interoperable or talking to one another, right?
Yes. So
on the SoundExchange side, we have what we believe is the authoritative ISRC, basically, 20 million plus ISRCs, and some databases might say they have 70 million. That doesn't mean that they're a better database. That means there's a lot of duplication and redundancy and cleanup that has to be done. So what SoundExchange actually does is they do a lot of the cleanup on the metadata. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is what's involved in that cleanup. So submitter A might submit the same ISRC or same track as submitter B, because submitter A has rights in one territory, but the feeds don't denote that, and SoundExchange looks at the overlaps and says, Houston, we have a problem. So they get the different submitters together, and they facilitate the resolution. SoundExchange doesn't arbitrate it, because the rights owners at the end of the day have to say what is theirs, but they flag it, they notify the parties, and it's resolved. That happens on the 114 side, because it's a statutory license. Most of the commerce is happening outside of 114, so you have all of these duplicative databases at Spotify or Pandora or Sirius or whomever is the distributor or the DSP, and these redundancies are happening over and over and over again. And so there's a lot of mess out there, even on the ISRC side, unless you have a central hub that's looking at it.
Okay, so what stops these databases now from coordinating, right? So you could imagine coordination that would reduce costs, increase accuracy, right? Take advantage of some of the data cleanup that companies like SoundExchange have been doing. What stops the market from reaching this result?
One side of the copyright, I think it's probably deployment on the publishing side. ISWC is not as broadly deployed as ISRC, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, we don't have, like I said before, a way to globally update the individual databases as the new information comes in, which is the workflow problem. The third issue is, for a company like ours, we're going to pay the PROs, under the rate that we're supposed to pay. We have no idea what happens after that. So having that money returned to the right people, i.e. the publishers and the writers, is a wholly separate process. And, we don't touch on the mechanical royalty, but clearly, if you've read any of the recent news reports, we have a real issue with the housing of that information in a way that can be quickly and readily matched between databases. So that, to me, is a standardization issue. So those are the three pain points that I've observed on the publishing side.
Lawrence has a good point, by the way. Incentives. I say that because unattributed income in most artists' contract is not shared with artists. Unattributed income goes into a pool that's divided by market share, and so there's an incentive to let it go into the unattributed income pool, because in a way the money is laundered. You don't have to share it downstream. It is stripped of its downstream royalty obligations, but it is then presented to the companies. I'm not against that, because I think that money has to go somewhere, but certainly escheatment statutes would suggest maybe the government wants a crack at it. If it is lost property, lost income, et cetera, that would be an incentive that would encourage everyone in the process to patriate that money or lose it to the attorneys general. That would be a potential situation. I would think there the economist makes an excellent point.
So in other countries, they have databases that are run as part of an extended collective licensing system, right? A very different system than the one that we have here in the States. Are there things that we can learn from those type of systems that we could apply here in the States to constructing our own richer data environment?
Look, I'll speak in favor of extended collective licensing. It's been working for over 60 years in the Nordic Scandinavian countries. What I like about it is that it frees the industry up. It does not substitute judgment for theirs. It does not have a government official saying this is what you must license, these are the terms and conditions. You negotiate them, but then they apply to everyone. So you might say, well, for some of the people they are having terms and conditions and prices substituted, but they are arrived at in an industry-wide negotiation. I think there is something that is powerful there or valuable there, as opposed to having rate court proceedings.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, though. It's a difference between two ideologies that I think people who believe in markets would both find weird, right? So the ideology that we're talking about in Europe is a kind of corporatist ideology, where a few large companies negotiate and set a pattern that everybody else has to play by.
Yes.
That's one model. That's kind of this corporatist model. The other model is this regulatory model, where we have a whole bunch of rules, mostly because of history, path dependency, partly because of the nature of competition, that are not market rules. They're kind of trying to simulate a market. Neither is particularly pretty. The unprettiness is different, right? So are there complaints from independent publishers and independent record companies in Europe that they're dealing on terms that prevent them from being innovative or competitive?
I don't hear them up there, and I do a fair amount of business there, but I'm certainly open to hearing it.
I think on the publishing side, there's been a call back for direct kind of control over the licensing outside of the collectives, both for privity with the service and for ease of negotiation. The lack of transparency in some of these European collectives is staggering. So there's a lot of waste in the passing from one collective to another because of territorial boundaries or the inability to match. And then it goes into a black box, and maybe that's distributed by market share, and there's no real transparency in how that gets done.
But that's been a big revolution with the digital age, because now the digital services, the statutory services report even the publishing on a census basis. So the PROs suddenly can, if they want to, distribute on that basis, whereas before it was more on a sample usage basis.
Right.
And you didn't get distribution down to the guy who was getting $2 or 50 cents. So that's been a huge revolution. It's caused everybody a lot of pain, I'm sure, on the data side, but it's also raised the call for transparency in a whole new way. All of the collectives were able to set a lot of rules the way they wanted to and deal with things in a very non-transparent way.
So Chairman Goodlatte's been having hearings for a while now, seeking input on potential changes to the copyright law. So after this discussion, and even before it, if you were talking to Chairman Goodlatte about what is needed from the government to get the industry toward this better data environment where data is more efficiently shared around and used, what would you need, right? Can this be done purely through private ordering, or does the government need to legislate or regulate in some way?
I think you need to fix the statutory license so it can actually be used by a service who wants to use it.
So what does that involve, fixing the statutory license?
Well, I mean, there are certain requirements in the statutory license that are virtually impossible to
So
comply
like the
with.
NOI, for example.
The NOI being sent prior to distribution. If you're a service that wants to have 40 million compositions, even if it's impossible to send out the 40 million NOIs and to be in compliance with the requirements to have searched the Copyright Office database and to be able to prove that you're in compliance. The reporting requirements, the audit, not the audit, but the certification by a CPA, you're never going to get CPAs to certify 40 million copyright royalty statements. So there are just a lot of things that are essentially impossible to comply with. So that if you can't know that you're penalty proof if you take on the statutory license for a digital music service, you can't just send NOI, so then you have to go back and direct negotiate.
Right. And then the NOI has a very clear timeline.
Yes.
In terms of when you have to reconcile this. You have the 30-day window. The negotiated mechanical has nothing. So, one of the things that, you can go back to 2010 and just look at the label publisher settlement, for example. So these are kinds of a perpetuated fuzziness, I think, that has gone into a digital age when we now have the ability to stream songs 24/7 across the planet on our pocket computers. So, if there are things to be done, I think they are probably more on the clarification side as opposed to just, eradicating the compulsory or other.
I'm not suggesting eradicating,
Right.
I'm suggesting fixing the
Fixing.
I know that you're not.
So just to be clear, we recommended, and this idea was, came up about 10 years ago, is making the 115 license a blanket license, more similar to the 114 license. So you would file maybe with more than one entity, but a limited number of entities, and your liability would be, you wouldn't have liability as long as you were doing what was required and paying royalties, and to the extent things couldn't be identified. And this is, we reiterated this this concept in the report, to the extent that you weren't able to match things or identify them, they'd go into a pool, and eventually actually, and under the SoundExchange system, those royalties eventually can be used to pay for the administrative costs of SoundExchange, so it lowers the cost for everyone. So, this is an idea that we've supported. It does seem crazy to have song-by-song licensing in an era where people are trying to get 30 million licenses or more. And, it's certainly, I think, an idea that needs to maybe be discussed again. And then within that, you need an economic incentives, to do the matching, to do good reporting, and not just dump everything into a claims pool. But, I think there could be administrative fees. There's ways to adjust maybe some of the economics of the license to encourage people to actually both, supply the needed data and also to do, if you're the service, to do appropriate reporting. Otherwise, you may be getting paid much more slowly, which is not in the interest of the copyright owner, if they're not supplying the data and so forth. So I think there are things that can be done within a blanket system that would encourage a lot of improvement.
But key, I think, is having one place that people can be told there's one place to go to update your information. And that's
Well, yeah.
so
There's
essential.
one ring that binds them, and of course, the problem is how does the price get set? That's what I'm.
Yeah, but I
How
want
does
to
the
take that
price-
on for a second.
Well, so the this is getting a little afield of the data discussion. I mean,
Yeah.
we propose that the MROs be given the ability to negotiate, and then if they reached a stalemate similar to what we have today, they would go to the CRB and get
have
a
a rate.
price. And that also, that CRB, to the extent there was sort of a surcharge to operate the general system, and others that pay for, especially in the early years, if they're really doing all the matching, creating this giant database, that the CRB could also set some sort of surcharge. So that part would be regulated.
Look, I think we can't just have one. And I think we won't just have one anyway. I mean, databases are like toothbrushes. Everybody knows you need one, and everybody wants to use their own. And that's just how it is. And that's okay. That's the market. That's the way it goes. What I'd like to see are market incentives brought to these databases approaches. When I look at ICANN and what's going on with domain name services, I look and I say, wow, this has built the internet. And if we did a survey of 1,000 musicians and said, do you know how to register your works? You'd get maybe 100 that knew. And if you said, do you know how to register a domain name? You'd get 900 that knew how to register their domain name, because there is so much outreach. It's a very competitive sector, that it is competitive on price and service. And so what I would like to see is us to think about government-approved or wholesale centers, or a core, around which retail activity occurs at the edge, where people are incentivized to register works. So, for example, with ICANN, you pay $1.65 to register with ICANN, and you get to keep the delta, the difference between the $1.65 and what the market could bear.
By the you mean somebody like GoDaddy. So the
I
analogy,
love to see
think,
GoDaddy in the reg business.
Right. So the analogy you're exploring here is that ICANN sits at the center of the domain name registration system.
They do.
Run the domain name servers, the root servers. They set rules about what the data has to look like. To
And they let
satisfy-
anyone run a root server.
But
Right.
there is an issue of governance of ICANN.
Oh, there are
as-
always gonna be
as you know,
governance.
And there will be an issue of governance.
Always
of
gonna be.
whatever a central coordinating organization. And I would think, 30, 40 years ago, we would have said Copyright Office. And the analogy would be to the county courthouse keeping track of the local real estate records. Alas, we're not in that world anymore. And so I would think, given that it's likely going to be some kind of nonprofit organization, ICANN, you would want to have representatives in the governance structure of the major interests.
Sure.
The distribution, the labels, the publishers, the Copyright Office certainly having a role there. But you've got to really think hard about governance. We've been lucky with ICANN. I would describe it as we've just been phenomenally lucky with ICANN. There's no guarantee we would be lucky again with a centralized or even your data.
Well, I'd let
source.
SoundExchange do it. I mean, I think we're all in agreement pretty much that they're the best in the field. They could do this, as could the Copyright Office, but my main point is that I don't think we should expect an Uber database to arrive out of one place with one party. I think there are so many languages and dialects, so much outreach that needs to be done around the world towards this end, and I think that government does not advertise well. I like government, but I have never seen a compelling government advertisement.
I mean,
You know, but
You don't stay up late enough.
When,
Okay.
when just think, in terms of a centralized database, when changes are made by a rights owner because of changes in administration or changes in ownership, that change should be made once and radiated out.
agreed,
All around,
agreed.
right? And so whoever controls that center, right, they should have, lines of communication with everybody outside. Because other services
Agreed.
may want to have their own,
Absolutely.
database, but someone has to be in charge of commandeering the whole thing.
And that's what I meant by different catcher's mitts. Like, for example, this is just an example. On the sound recording side, DDEX, globally signaled. We've got the catcher's mitt, and sure, it would be harder to organize and go back into the soup, as my friend Benji Rogers calls it, with, the hellscape of musical works and joint works and assignments, but it's not above the wit of humanity to achieve.
Yeah, so I can imagine a few liability rules that would achieve that. So for example, if someone registers an ownership interest in a work and they don't signal what the shares are, the default rule of copyright applies, and whoever has to work it out, it's not the musical rights organization or the general musical rights organization, it's the people. There'll be lawsuits between people, and that will incentivize them to work it out, because lawsuits between people about splits are super expensive. So we want to leave time for questions from the audience. We don't have a ton of time, but we'd love to hear from you about data issues, deep geekery, and there must be an appetite for it.
Nobody's rushing to the microphone.
Appetite for geekery.
I think there was more an appetite for locks this morning than there is for geekery now.
Yeah, this is how the world is failing to match up with the expertise of lawyers and the expertise of engineers.
Well, here's the thing. For lawyers, I've noticed, you've got to have a bar card number,
Right.
and you're registered.
That's right.
This is rock solid, and it's because we want to reduce the risk. We want to reduce the possibility that this person is a fraud or whatever, and we've seen enough of it. And yet, we don't communicate with these unique numbers enough in the musical field. And this is the crazy part to people, is that they go buy a candy bar with their Amex card, and if they've got their reporting set right, they get an email before they're back to the office saying you just bought a candy bar with your Amex card, which is a globally unique identifier. But with music, we still report with artist name, song title, album title too often. Now, it's not to say that we do not try to get people to move to that globally unique identifier, but that, to me, is the key, because that is step one in the data process, is reporting, I just used this sound recording. And that has to be done without ambiguity. And if it's done, artist name, song title, etc., it's ambiguous, it's semantic. And by the way, you can only imagine how that works as we go global as an industry, right? As we go into China, we go into Asia, we go throughout Eastern Europe, etc., Ergo-Hungaric languages. And these people, English isn't the first language, and yet we are expecting reports to come this way. It's mad.
Yeah, well, speaking of buying a candy bar with your Amex card, it's not just the Amex card that has a unique identifier, it's also the candy bar.
Yes.
It has a barcode. And every single thing you buy of that kind has a barcode, so and there's an organization that oversees all of that, and they seem to do a good job. So would that be a good model?
I'm for it, and by the way, we use it. We use UPC. We register our albums with UPC codes. Oddly enough, there was someone who falsified millions of them, Jeff Price, when he was at TuneCore, both UPC codes and ISRC codes. But in the main, we respect that process, and we try to get it used. I think the reason I emphasize it so much, I know it's not at odds with what we're hoping for, because we do want to wring the ambiguity out of the system. But one of the keys to doing it and how it relates to databases is that service. So I've called these services, I've called Pandora, I've called others and said, hey, tell me, are you reporting with ISRC code? No, we're not doing it. Why? Well, we don't have a publicly accessible, comprehensive, authenticated database of them. And so that brings us to this panel. I think there's millions of great questions about licensing, but the one I'm focused on right now is if we report unambiguously, the creator will be paid. That money will reach them. If we do not, it will not happen.
Since no one else is up here, I'll ask another one. if there is such difficulty in creating a big universal database, and I agree that there has been, why not focus on the concept of interoperability among the different proprietary databases for which there is competitive advantage in certain ways? Why not focus on standards for interoperability?
By the way,
I think that's what we're talking about, Bill. I mean,
Right.
honestly,
Well, you've been talking about sort of slices of that.
you can have two things at the same time. You know, we can do that. We can have a standards body, and we can have a backstop, and we can have interoperable, machine-readable databases that talk to each other, are able to reconcile differences more quickly. And also, to get back to the candy bar analogy, you know, that weird, creepy, uncanny valley of marketing where they anticipate what you want to buy because you bought something before. Imagine the nudges that can happen. Hey, figure out your joint works, kiddo, because, you know, this is sitting here in the system tied to an ISWC, but we haven't got those splits locked down. We're at the dawn of a data service industry in music. We're here, but we haven't completely, you know, dialed it in. I think that there's going to be a combination of factors that are going to get us there, and certainly the market incentive that arises from having good, clean data that works with whoever you're partnered
Or
with.
the
is one of them.
lawsuit-derived incentive.
Or the wrong incentives, as the case may be.
Let me just add about the barcode, the UPC. Who's the organization that runs it? It's an organization. The governance is split between the manufacturers and the retailers, the two major groups that have an interest in having a universal code and having it work properly and making innovations in it. That's, you know, the governance, again, being crucial.
I just want to congratulate everybody on the panel for not saying the word blockchain. Oops.
We had a long discussion about that a couple of weeks ago. We decided probably not to open that morass.
That's a whole nother conference.
Yeah, exactly. So let me ask you guys to anticipate the next panel a little bit without stealing their thunder. Imagine that we're in a world where we have databases that are talking to one another. We have an agreed upon data structure. The proprietary databases are participating in this. You know, there's a central database that's independently run. There's some legal changes that give the incentives for people to put information into the database. There's some changes at the Copyright Office to encourage people to provide globally unique identifiers. All that stuff is in place. What can happen? Right? What's the biggest change to the music licensing landscape that will be actuated by that if we achieve it?
I'll try to answer this. There's two reasons why you need good data. One is licensing in as a service, so you want to be able to negotiate your rates and terms and decide how to segment your catalog. You may want certain songs or tracks and not others, depending on rates and pricing. The other one is the outward bound on payment. So you want the clarity and the transparency and the efficiency, the timeliness of the reportings. So if you fix the outward bound and the inward bound through metadata, you'd have a lot more commerce. And that's the end goal of everybody.
Yeah, I think the machine-readable data is very important. Right now, everybody employs staff everywhere to vet conflicts, to track down missing information, and if you actually could get rid of a lot of those resources and have totally machine-readable data.
I mean, in some instances, there's going to be, trust me, there's things where a human eye can tell you, okay, this song duration tied to this ISRC or ISWC is what's going to tell me, or it could be you're looking at a distributing label instead of a sub-label, instead of a, you know, a payee or whatever. And there are those things that, but the root of finding those anomalies is probably having the numeric identifier, because you can run these things at the millisecond against one another, and it'll make your resolution much more efficient, I believe.
Yeah.
this is the argument for copyright itself, that we incentivize creation with reward, that it find the creator. Anything else is actually destructive of the incentive. To see one's money go to someone else other than them is surely the antithesis of copyright and could not be defended by anyone in the industry. To me, the beauty of this issue and this panel and this thing is that the arts stemmed from a desire to create databases of ownership. I say that because clay tablets and reeds were first used to create property boundaries and maps. And so the desire to write came from the desire to enumerate, this is where my land starts, this is where it ends. And so this is a fundamental desire that humankind has, and that brought us to the arts themselves, writing, expressing oneself, and so forth. So it's of the essence that we do this right if we are to get what we do right. That's how important it is. That's how it plays itself out. These are the predicates for a sustainable economy of ideas and their expression.
All right, well, thank you very much all for a great panel of deep digital database geekery. And we'll take a break now and then move on to panel number 3. Join me in thanking the panelists.